Joseph's story is a bit of a roller coaster. He is sold into slavery by his brothers, but somehow finds favor with his new master and is promoted to chief of his household. He is thrown into prison, but somehow finds favor with the chief guard and is promoted to the position of warden. Then, unexpectedly, this prisoner slave somehow finds favor with Pharaoh and is promoted to prime minister of Egypt. Behind all this good fortune and favor is God, who is looking after Abraham's family just as promised. Joseph's testimony is that even when others try to harm God's plan and people, God is still there, working things for their good. What can we learn from the story of Joseph?
At the age of 6, he left Haran with his family and journeyed to the land of Canaan, eventually settling in Hebron. Jacob displayed extra affection to Joseph, who was born to his father's old age, presenting him with a specially crafted garment. This prompted feelings of jealousy within his brothers, especially the sons of Jacob's other wife, Leah. These ill feelings exasperated when Joseph repeated 2 of his dreams to them, in which he was portrayed as ruling over his brethren. In the first, the brothers were gathering wheat in the field, and the brothers' bundles bowed to Joseph's bundles. In the second, Joseph envisioned the sun, the moon, and 11 stars, symbolising his parents and brothers, bowing to him. Soon enough, when Joseph was 17, the tension came to a head. One day, Jacob instructed Joseph to visit his brothers in Shechem, where they were tending their sheep. Little did he know that this would be the last time he would see his dear son until their reunion a long 22 years later. Seizing their chance, the brothers threw the unsuspecting Joseph into a pit. A short while later, they spotted an Arab caravan passing the scene, and the brothers sold Joseph to the traders. He was eventually brought to Egypt, where he was sold to Potiphar, one of the king's Pharaoh's ministers. For a while, things started to look up for young Joseph. Divine success enabled him to find favour in his master's eyes, and he was appointed head of Potiphar's estate. However, this would not last long. Attracted by his handsome looks, Potiphar's wife desired to be intimate with him. To her consternation, Joseph continuously refused. One day, when no one was home other than the 2 of them, the mistress grasped Joseph's garment, demanding that he consent. Thinking quickly, Joseph slid out of his cloak and ran outside. This self-control earned him the appellation Joseph the Righteous. But Potiphar's wife turned the tables on Joseph, telling her husband that it was Joseph who had tried to entice her. The angry master reacted by placing his trustworthy assistant in prison. Joseph's charisma followed him into prison as well, and the warden soon appointed him as his right-hand man. In time, his unique qualities expressed themselves in an additional area. When the king's royal cupbearer and baker were imprisoned, Joseph successfully interpreted their dreams, correctly predicting that the cupbearer would be released and the baker hanged. 2 years later, King Pharaoh himself envisioned 2 dreams, which none of his advisors were able to explain. Remembering the Hebrew youth from his prison days, the cupbearer suggested that Joseph be summoned. Joseph, then 30, interpreted Pharaoh's dreams as being a divine prediction for 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and advised Pharaoh to prepare by storing grain during the first 7 years. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh appointed him as his viceroy, second only to the king himself, and tasked him with readying the nation for years of famine. Meanwhile, the effects of the famine were felt in nearby Canaan. Hearing that there was grain in Egypt, Joseph's brothers journeyed there to buy precious food from the viceroy, not realising that he was their very own brother. Joseph decided to utilise this opportunity to observe whether his brothers truly regretted having sold him. Using a succession of dramatic manoeuvres, Joseph tested his brothers' determination to save their youngest brother, Benjamin, Joseph's only maternal brother, from the plot he set up for them. Once he saw their devotion toward Benjamin, Joseph finally revealed his identity to his astonished siblings. Following this heartfelt reunion, Jacob and his family settled in the Goshen section of Egypt. During the 7 years of plenty, Joseph married and had 2 sons who Jacob blessed and gave them the right to be treated as independent tribes. Joseph ruled Egypt for a total of 80 years until his death at the age of 110. Before his passing, he made his brothers promise to take his coffin along with them when they would eventually leave Egypt for the Promised Land. After his death, he was embalmed and laid to rest in Egypt. And indeed, when the Jews left Egypt many years later, Moses made sure to locate Joseph's tomb and carry his remains to the land of Israel.
Thank you very much indeed. One of those lessons, isn't it? Make sure you know how long the reading is before you accept the request to read. So, the story of Joseph. If I'm honest, I found thinking through this and what I wanted to say quite difficult. And I found it quite difficult for a number of reasons. First of all, this is basically a story. And there is part of me that says a story is a story, and it's something that happens, and it is indeed in our scriptures, so we can see something of God in it, but in the end, it's a story. And I'm always just slightly doubtful of picking out meaning when there wasn't any meaning there. It was something that happened to people. We can see something of the relationships between different people, and we can see God's interaction with them. But as for saying, in this verse it says this, therefore we should, I'm a bit doubtful about that. The other thing to say about this is that context and what society is like at this time is so very, very different from today. And it's quite tricky, I think, sometimes to look back. I mean, I don't know if you find this. Sometimes I look back just a few years and think how society around me has changed and how I have changed and how I would not want to be judged now for what I thought then. And that's maybe only 20 or 30 years ago, maybe even less. Now, this is, centuries ago. And so society was very different. In terms of history, I think it's quite hard to look back and say we judge people on this because their context was different. On the other hand, we might say, these are human beings. More than that, they are followers of God. They are chosen of God. So why wasn't their relationships with each other different and better? So that's why I found this quite difficult. I've also found it really interesting because I suspect that I've never actually sat down with the Bible and read the story of Joseph from the beginning to the end. I thought I've known it through the musical, and I've read this and thought, oh my goodness, I didn't know this. And quite a few things inevitably are quite different. So if you have a Bible in front of you, the Bibles are different, so I can't give you page numbers, but we are in the first book of the Bible, so it's relatively easy to find. We are, I'm pleased to say, limited in the number of Bibles, because that means there are more people than Bibles, which is good, but also apparently lots of Bibles have been given away. What an excellent reason not to have Bibles. So if you haven't got a Bible, maybe on your phone, you could turn to Genesis chapter 35, and if you have got a Bible, it's still Genesis chapter 35. It's not a big surprise. Okay, Genesis chapter 35 is where the story of Joseph sort of begins. So we're going to be sort of jumping around a bit from 35 up to chapter 50, which is where Genesis ends and where this story ends. So every now and then I'll shout out some verses and we can see if we can find them there. But before we look at this story in general, I want to look first of all at the family that Joseph grew up as, because I think that, as I said at the beginning, a lot of what goes on can be understood in terms of family position and relationships between people. So if we could just put the first family tree type thing up, thank you. Don't worry too much about the names at the bottom. Jacob is the father, who I suspect you talked about last week, but I haven't actually seen that, but I'm sure that you did. Jacob had 2 wives. His first wife was Leah and his second wife was Rachel. They both had servant, slave really, girls, women who had children with Jacob. So Jacob had 12 sons. He had 6 with Leah. He had 2 with Rachel and 2 each with the other slave women. And it's not quite as straightforward as to say, you know, it's Leah and then this person and this person. It was a bit sort of toing and froing, as it were. So you can already see that things are a little complicated. And in terms of context, this is, I imagine, something we're not entirely comfortable with. So again, there's the question, you know, to what extent do we say that was the culture? To what extent do we say, is this actually what God wanted? So we've already got a complicated family that's going on here. 12 sons who come from different parents. So if you could put the next slide up, please. This tells us where the different sons were born, or who to. And Leah has 4 children, 4 sons, and then the 2 servants have their children, then Leah does, and then Rachel does. Rachel has the last of Jacob's 12 boys, and indeed dies giving birth to Benjamin. So this is just the structure. This is how it is. There's not necessarily a problem here. The culture is different, but this is the family as it is. The first problem that we come to is that Jacob did not treat his 12 sons equally. So his favourites were Joseph and Benjamin, partly because they were his last, but also because he loved Rachel more than he loved Leah, and there's no pretense of any love with the servant women. And this favoritism of Joseph in particular and Benjamin is something that colours the whole of their lives. It comes at the beginning, as it were, when Joseph is given the beautiful cloth and so forth, and it continues all the way virtually to the end. So we could say that a lot of the difficulties of this family come from Jacob. He is the person who, you know, is head of the family, and anyway, Rachel has died, who instigates this favoritism, and we might blame him for that. But if you just put the next slide up, this might remind you, I'm not entirely sure which bits you talked about last week. Jacob was one of a twin, so Esau was his twin, and they were brought up in a family. Father is Isaac and the mother is Rebecca, and one of them favoured one and one of them favoured the other. So Isaac is very, very fond of Esau, and Rebecca is very, very fond of Jacob. So this idea of having favourites in the family is something that Jacob has already grown up with. Maybe this is what he thought family life actually was, so that when he then had his own family, he just thought this is what is expected. So the fault lines, as it were, are already there. So now I want to look at Jacob and also at Joseph and also the brothers. And just to say, the other reason why I found this difficult is that I wasn't absolutely clear whether this was a story of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or whether actually it was 1 step forward and 2 steps back. You know, the musical has, you know, Joseph is badly treated, Then then God steps in, then all these things happen to him. Then he saves Egypt and indeed all the rest of the world. They all have enough to eat and everybody thinks Joseph is absolutely wonderful. That would not be any steps back. That would be, moving on. Everyone thinks he's brilliant and he's done what God wants. When we look at the story, it's just a little bit more complicated than that. And it would be so nice to stand here and say, they didn't know much about God, then they learnt a lot about God, and then all of this happened, and now we can all go and do likewise, as it were. But it's not really quite like that. So let's start then with the father, with Jacob, and the fact that he has this favouritism of Joseph. So the favouritism starts at the time of his birth because he is born to Rachel. Jacob loves Rachel. When he went and worked for his uncle, he first met Rachel and he said, I love you so much, I want to marry you. And his to-be father-in-law said, that's fine, you can marry her. All you've got to do is to work for 7 years. So he worked for 7 years, and there's a delightful phrase in the Bible where he says he worked for 7 years, but it was as if no time at all, for he loved her so much. What a lovely story. However, his father-in-law, he got to marry Rachel, except the next morning he looked and his father-in-law had tricked him and given him their older sister. So he was married to Leah. Leah then knew she was second best, knew that really it was Rachel who was the favoured one. And so she lived a lot of her life with that sort of uncertainty, that uncomfortableness, that maybe bitterness inside her. Rachel is the one that Jacob loved, and after he'd married Leah, he then married Rachel and worked for another 7 years, 14 years, to have 2 wives. So the favouritism began from the time that Joseph was born, for he was born to the wife that Jacob really loved. Then when he is a teenager, he is then given this cloth, which is this ostentatious example of how much my father loves me, and thereby to the other brothers doesn't love you as much. So the favouritism is obvious and is there. But it actually carries on right until the end. For when we've had all the shenanigans of the brothers going down to Egypt and then coming back and saying, we have to take Benjamin with us because he'd left Benjamin at home. And Jacob said to these other brothers standing around, you can't take Benjamin. I have lost Joseph and there is nobody else left other than Benjamin. And who does he say that to? He says it to his own sons. So his favouritism is such that he actually discounts all that the other 10 brothers are and all that the other 10 brothers have actually done. And he says to them face to face, no, you can't take Benjamin. You can't take Benjamin because he is the only one who is left. That is after years and years of thinking and experience. Really, in terms of parenthood, I think we would have to give him a low score. The basics, treats children equally. And here he is, as a relatively old man, saying, no, the only one who counts is Benjamin because I've already lost Joseph. So, starting with Jacob then, he's really not done so well. Moving on to Joseph, perhaps inevitably, given what his father, the way his father has treated him, he becomes a spoiled brat. There he is with his wonderful cloak. At one point, his brothers are out doing the work for their father, looking after the animals and the sheep and so forth. And his father says to him, can you just go and check out on your brothers, please, and then come back? So he goes out, sees what they're doing. I mean, he's not working, they are. Goes, sees how they're doing, comes back and says to his father, really, they're not very good. They're not working very hard. I don't think you'd be happy with what they're doing. They're taking lots of breaks. They're not looking after the animals. They're really quite a failure. So if he wants to endear himself to his brothers, that's not a good way of going about it. And then what does he do? He adds to that these dreams, whereby the corn is bowing down and the sun and the moon and so forth. He might well have had these dreams. He might well, even at this young age, be able to interpret them. Indeed, his brothers could interpret them. The sensible thing would be, wouldn't it, is not to tell your brothers of the dreams that you've had. So you could have them, you could see them as a message from God. Is it helpful to share that to your brothers? Probably not, but he did. And why has he got the confidence to do that? Because if his brothers complain, his father's got his back. So he has become a spoilt and a selfish person in the course of his upbringing. So 2 steps forward and 1 back, or 1 forward and 2 back. What happened to Joseph? He does show integrity, he does show hard work, he does show that he can look out for other people, and he does build those bridges with his brothers. So possibly, I think, 2 forward and 1 back. The 1 back we're going to come to in just a moment. And then his brothers. Conniving brothers. So if we turn to the passage which whereby they are put, when Joseph is put into the well, which is chapter 37. So they want to get rid of Joseph. He's been sent to check up on them again. They want to get rid of him, and they think about killing him, and then Reuben says, no, don't kill him, put down a well instead. And then Judah says, oh, even better, we'll sell him, thereby we'll get some money for him. So now they've got to go back to their father, and they've got to tell him what's happened. They're obviously not going to say, by the way, Dad, we've sold your favourite son. So they've got to come back and give him a story. So the story that they give him, sorry, I just need to find it. Verse 31 of chapter 37. So they, the brothers, got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this, examine it to see whether it's your son's robe. Well, obviously it is, because he's the only one with that sort of robe. He recognised it and said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. So they don't actually lie outright and say, this is what's happened to Joseph. They don't say, that a goat tore him to pieces, which seems unlikely, or that a wild animal did. They just said, hi, Dad, here's the evidence. What do you think might have happened to Joseph? So I just feel like in some ways that's even more conniving than saying a lion got him or whatever it was that attacked him. So they were, I think, really quite underhand in the way that they reported what actually happened to Joseph or not. Turn with me to the end of the story, to chapter 50. To chapter 50. So Jacob has just died. Joseph and all his brothers are well established. They're prosperous. They're living in a part of Egypt. But the brothers are still worried. So verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of your servants of God, your father. And when the message came to him, Joseph wept. Joseph does an awful lot of weeping during this story. There's a lot of private weeping and there's a lot of public weeping as well. We have no evidence that Jacob actually told them that this is what he wanted to say. So even after they've been through all their experiences, it seems to me they are still coming up with the same sort of story as they came up with years ago when they held up the robe to Jacob and said, I wonder what could have happened to Joseph when you see the blood here. It's exactly the same. Is this 1 step forward and 2 back, or 2 forward and 1 back? For all that they had seen, for all that God has done, they are still showing those same characteristics of twisting words, really, making people think the way that they want them to think. 2 steps forward or 1 step forward. There are 2 other things that I want to pick out here. First of all, the question of the role of women in this story. So we've had 2 wives and we've had 2 slave women. The role of women all that's said is, they give birth. There's things about their names and so forth. They give birth. They do have a name, which is better than many times. But they're just like, they're just people that we pass by. We talk about the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob. But what about the God of Rachel and the God of Leah? That's not part of it. And if you read this story from beginning to end, there are times when there are other women who are treated just dreadfully. In this story of redemption, just redemption, there are people who are just sort of glossed over. And there's part of me, whilst I don't want to take verse by verse, I did think to myself, are there times when actually in our society, in our town, in our church, in the way we treat people, where because it's socially acceptable to do so, we gloss over them. We don't stop and think because that's what our culture says we do. And what happens here to these women, this is not unusual. Indeed, in many ways, it's better because they do have names. They do get to give names to their sons. But it's entirely in keeping with the culture. And I wonder, in 20 years' time, when I look back at how I acted at this time, would I think, oh, yes, I didn't do that for that person, or I didn't do this, or I didn't really engage with that group of people. Because at that time, society says it was all right. And we need to look a little deeper. How is society going to change? Let's be ahead of society. As a church and followers of Jesus, to be people who actually say we're going to stop and think, who is it that don't actually feature? And we're going to do something about that. And then just to take one other aspect. So Joseph, he does indeed manage to save people. People do not die because he has gathered up the grain. He's built all these great barns and so forth. And people have what they need. But there is just a little bit more to this part of the story. So if you will turn with me to chapter 41. Chapter 41 and verse 46. So we're at the point of the story when Joseph has interpreted the dreams. He said there's going to be 7 of plenty and there's 7 of famine. So this is where we're at. Joseph, verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and travelled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In the cities, then the food grown in the fields surrounding. He stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. So people gave of their abundance. They were growing more than they needed, and they gave it to Joseph to store up in order to be prepared for the time of famine. Let's just move on to verse 56. Verse 56. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was great. So people gave of their excess, and then when they didn't have enough, the food, the grain, was sold back to them. Here is a big difference. It goes on though. If we go to chapter 47, and verse 13. So the famine's got worse, and it's spread. It's not only in Egypt, but it's also in Canaan, which is where Jacob is. So verse 13, there was no food, however, in the whole region because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain that they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. So they give the grain, then they have to buy it, then they need to pay even more for it in order to get what perhaps is becoming slightly scarce, so that all the money has now gone to Pharaoh on the back of something that used to belong to the people. It goes on. Verse 15, when the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, so all the money's gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, give us food, why should we die? Our money is all gone. Verse 16, so Joseph says, then bring your livestock. So now they have to bring their cows and their cattle and so forth in order to pay for the food that they gave in the first place. Verse 17, so they brought their livestock and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep, their goats, their cattle and their donkeys. So they've lost their money, now they've lost their livestock. And now verse 20. So Joseph So a bit before, verse 19, why should we perish before your eyes, we and our land as well? Buy us and our land in exchange for food, and our land will be in bondage to Pharaoh. Verse 20, so Joseph brought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. So they lose their money, they lose their livestock, they lose their land, and finally, verse 21, Joseph said to the people, now that I have brought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed, but on from that, you will be kept, in verse 25, you have saved our lives, they said, may we find favour, we will be in bondage to Pharaoh. So, when at the end of the musical, people sing praises to Joseph and they're all well fed and they haven't died, this is true. And Joseph, towards the end of the story, when he's with his brothers, he says to them, that they are not to feel bad about what happened because God went before him into Egypt to save people's lives. One step forward. But how were those lives saved? They were saved by this bigger thing that was going on in society, whereby people did what Joseph said. And how sensible. Store up grain when there is plenty. And then how was that twisted by Pharaoh and then implemented by Joseph? So that people went from being free people who grew an excess, giving to society to store up and to keep them in later time. And they ended up in bondage with no livestock, no money and no land. So I struggle with this story, for Joseph did say to his brothers, and it is a story of redemption, it's a story of forgiveness. If you have time, as we don't now, read the story through and look at the person of Judah, who's a bit of a sort of bit piece on this, and he does some awful things. I'm talking about the position of women, dreadful, dreadful things. But actually, he comes out as the person saying that he would stand in for Benjamin. So there is a story of redemption there, and there is a story of forgiveness of Joseph and the brothers, and there is reunion with Jacob. But underlying it all, there are questions about how women are treated. There are questions about how leadership uses its power. And then I paused and I thought, actually, I wonder if I look back over my life, like Joseph, I would be able to say, God has been there, gone in front, been behind, been side to side. But has my life been like the musical? I started here and I ended up with people living and all singing lovely songs and so forth. Or actually, are there times when I treat people badly, either as individuals or as groups? Are there times when power has been misused by other people, by ourselves, or by me? And still I hold on to God was there. So for myself, is it one step forward and two back? Or is it two steps forward and one back? I leave you with the thought that I think when we pick up the Bible, we need to have some honesty as we look at it, and not just put a gloss of what we want it to read. It is our scriptures, we can learn from it, but it isn't a jolly musical. And there are bits in here that we've had of the 15 chapters that I pretty much guarantee you will read and wince. And yet we will also speak of the fact that Jacob and Joseph and through Judah and through others, all those failed and flawed human beings, God was there and God is still with us, failed and flawed human beings. Amen.